The history of Germany is a massive, sweeping drama, full of sharp turns playing out right in the beating heart of Europe. You would be hard-pressed to find another nation on Earth that has experienced such devastating collapses and such meteoric, dizzying rises. In this video, we are going to unravel the darkest and most defining secrets of this land. We are going to look at how tribal warriors utterly destroyed the invincible Roman legions, how a religious fracture plunged the region into 30 years of pure chaos, and how Otto von Bismarck forged a fractured landscape into an empire, using nothing but blood and iron. We will walk through the fire of the First World War, step into the golden, manic 20s of the Weimar Republic, where Einstein was reshaping our understanding of the universe, and we will take an unflinching look at the dark catastrophe of the Third Reich. We will watch the drama of the Cold War unfold, witness the sudden rise of the Berlin Wall, and stand in the historic moment it came crashing down, transforming Germany into the undisputed economic engine of modern Europe. If this journey through the forgotten pages of history resonates with you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what shadows of the past you want us to explore next. Sit back and listen closely. At the very dawn of the first century, the European continent was split into two completely alien worlds. Down south, the colossal Roman Empire stretched across the map. This was a superpower of paved roads, aqueducts, bustling stone cities, written laws, and the most lethal military machine the ancient world had ever seen. Rome had already crushed the Gauls, the ancestors of modern the French, and had drawn its natural border along the wide, rushing waters of the Rhine River. But look east of the Rhine, and you found a boundless, wild frontier. The Romans simply called it Germania. Germania back then was not a country. There were no cities, no paved roads, no central king. It was a dark expanse of ancient forests and treacherous swamps, inhabited by dozens of fiercely independent tribes. You had the Cherusci, the Chatti, the Brutteri, the Marcomanni, and many others. To the Romans, they were all just Germans. These people lived in small, scattered settlements, hidden deep within the impenetrable woods. They survived by herding cattle, scratching out primitive farms, and hunting. Their entire society was glued together by bloodlines and the heavy authority of tribal elders. For a Germanic man, nothing mattered more than his personal bravery in combat. Every tribe had a chieftain, but his word was not absolute law. The real power lay in the assembly of warriors, a gathering called the Thing, where major decisions were made by the men holding the spears. These tribes valued their freedom above breathing. They fought constantly, not just against outsiders, but bitterly among themselves. And for Rome, these aggressive, unpredictable neighbors were a massive headache. Germanic raiding parties were routinely slipping across the Rhine, looting Roman outposts in Gaul, and vanishing back into the trees. Finally, the Emperor Augustus decided he had had enough. He wanted to end the raids once and for all by pushing the borders of the empire further east, moving the frontier from the Rhine all the way to the Elbe River. The Roman legions marched in. They began a systematic conquest of the Germanic lands, building fortified camps, demanding taxes, and forcing the tribes to kneel to Roman law. In the year 7, a man named Publius Quintilius Varus was appointed as the governor of this newly carved-out province of Germania. Varus was a seasoned bureaucrat, but his experience was in the eastern provinces, dealing with populations that had already been broken. He looked at the Germanic tribes with sheer arrogance. He figured he could easily tame them with strict courts and heavy taxation. What Varus completely failed to grasp was that to a free-born Germanic warrior, paying tribute and bowing to a foreign judge was a fate worse than death. Beneath the quiet surface of the forests, the tribal nobility began to plot. Right inside Varus's inner circle was a young Germanic aristocrat named Arminius. He was born into the royal bloodline of the Cherusci tribe. As a boy, he had been taken to Rome as a political hostage, a standard imperial tactic to ensure good behavior from conquered kings. But in Rome, Arminius didn't just survive, he thrived. He received a top-tier military education, learned to speak flawless Latin, and mastered the inner workings of Roman battlefield tactics. He proved himself a brilliant commander, leading auxiliary Germanic cavalry units for the empire. Rome rewarded him with citizenship and elevated him to the prestigious rank of knight. Governor Verus trusted Arminius with his life. He looked at the young warrior and saw a loyal, Romanized ally who could help bring civilization to the barbarians. But Arminius was playing a long game. Deep down, he was still a son of the forest. He watched his people losing their identity under the Roman boot, and he harbored a quiet, burning desire to tear the empire down. Using his high-ranking position, Arminius began holding secret midnight meetings with the chieftains of various rival tribes. He pulled off a diplomatic miracle. He convinced men who had spent their lives slitting each other's throats to bury the hatchet and unite against the eagle standards of Rome. In the autumn of the year 9, Verus and his army were stationed deep in Germanic territory near the Weser River. As the season turned cold and it was time to march back to their winter quarters near the Rhine, Arminius sprang his trap. He used a network of informants to feed Verus fake reports about a sudden tribal uprising in a remote district. Verus took the bait. He decided to deviate from the safe, established military roads to personally crush the rebellion. The Roman war machine lumbered into motion. It was a massive, incredibly vulnerable column. We are talking about 3 elite legions, 6 auxiliary cohorts, and 3 squadrons of cavalry. That is roughly 20,000 professional killers. But trailing behind them was a massive civilian baggage train filled with merchants, wives, children, and servants. The procession stretched out for miles. Their new route took them straight into the Teutoburg Forest. This was a nightmare landscape. Rolling hills covered in ancient towering oak trees cut through by deep ravines and bottomless bogs. There was no road. The legionaries literally had to hack their way through the underbrush and build wooden causeways over the mud just to keep moving. And then the sky broke open. A massive, violent storm rolled in. Torrential rain turned the forest floor into a slick soup of mud. The Romans were soaked, exhausted, and their heavy leather and iron armor became dead weight. Because of the tight trees and the treacherous ground, the marching column lost its tight formation. It stretched out thinner and thinner. Arminius and his cavalry had been riding with Verus as an escort. Under the excuse of riding ahead to gather more Germanic allies to help put down the fake rebellion, Arminius slipped away into the trees. He didn't go to find help. He went to take command of the massive coalition army that was already waiting in the shadows. The ambush was a masterclass in terror. The Germanic warriors knew every hidden trail in that forest. They didn't charge out. They stayed hidden in the thick brush, raining a relentless storm of javelins down onto the straggling Roman line. The Romans tried to form up into their legendary defensive squares, the tactics that had conquered the world. But the trees were too tight, the mud was too slick, and the bogs swallowed their boots. The Germanic fighters would launch brutal hit-and-run strikes, butchering a pocket of soldiers, and then vanish back into the mist before the Romans could swing their swords. The slaughter lasted for 3 agonizing days. The Romans tried desperately to hack their way west toward the Rhine. They managed to build fortified camps each night, but every morning the march resumed, and the attacks never stopped. On the 3rd day, the bleeding, battered remnants of the Roman army found themselves pinned on a narrow strip of land, trapped between a steep hill and a bottomless swamp. The Germanic tribes had spent the night building a massive earthen wall right across their path. From behind that wall, they delivered the final crushing blow. Realizing that his army was annihilated, and refusing to be paraded through the mud as a captive, Governor Verus took his own life, throwing himself onto his sword. His senior officers saw this and did the same. Without leadership, the surviving legionaries broke and panicked. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were wiped from the face of the earth. The Germanic warriors captured the sacred silver eagles of the legions, the ultimate humiliation for the empire. When the news of the Teutoburg Forest reached Rome, the city froze in absolute terror. Ancient historians tell us that Emperor Augustus stopped cutting his hair and his beard for months. He would wander the halls of his palace, violently banging his head against the door frames, screaming into the empty corridors, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions!" Rome was paralyzed by the fear that the Germanic tribes would cross the Rhine and march straight for the capital. That invasion never came. A few years later, Roman generals, specifically Germanicus, launched brutal revenge campaigns. They managed to recover the stolen eagles and bury the bleached bones of their dead. But Rome never stayed. The emperors made a cold, calculated, strategic choice. They abandoned the dream of conquering the lands east of the Rhine. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was a massive pivot point in human history. The Rhine River hardened into a permanent psychological and physical border between the classical Roman civilization and the untamed Germanic world. Because of Arminius, the tribes kept their freedom, their language, and their unique culture. That single ambush in the Rhine guaranteed that Central Europe would develop on its own independent path for centuries to come. Fast forward a few hundred years. The Western Roman Empire collapses, and the continent is thrown into the chaotic blender of the migration period. For centuries, Germanic tribes swept across Europe, warring, settling, and forging new alliances. Out of this violent melting pot, one group rose above the rest: the Franks. By the 8th century, they had carved out a massive dominion that covered modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and a huge chunk of Western Germany. The Frankish state hit its absolute peak under a ruler from the Carolingian dynasty named Charles the Great, better known to history as Charlemagne. He took the throne in 768 and ruled with an iron grip for over 45 years. Charlemagne was a warlord on a mission. He waged endless campaigns to expand his borders and force the Christian faith onto pagan lands. His longest, most brutal conflict was the Saxon War. The Saxons were a fierce Germanic tribe up north who refused to bow. The war dragged on for over 30 blood-soaked years. The Saxons fought like demons, staging uprisings and spitting on the Christian cross. But Charlemagne eventually broke them with overwhelming military force. Through these conquests, Charlemagne managed to unite almost all the Christian people of Western Europe under one banner. Then, in the year 800, a moment that changed the map occurred. Inside St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed an imperial crown on Charlemagne's head. The empire was officially back from the dead. Charlemagne viewed himself as the true successor to the Roman Caesars, and his realm became the beating cultural and political heart of the West. His court sponsored science, built massive monasteries, opened schools, and preserved ancient texts. Historians call this spark of light the Carolingian Renaissance. But there was a fatal flaw. This colossal empire was held together by nothing but the sheer, terrifying willpower of Charlemagne himself. When he died in 814, the crown passed to his son Louis the Pious. Louis barely managed to keep the seams from ripping apart. When Louis died, his 3 sons immediately plunged the empire into a vicious, bloody civil war for supremacy. The brothers fought themselves to a standstill, eventually realizing that one man could no longer rule at all. In 843, in the city of Verdun, Charlemagne's 3 grandsons signed a piece of parchment that shattered the empire. The Treaty of Verdun split the Frankish realm into 3 distinct pieces. The eldest Lothair took the middle strip, including Italy and the lands along the Rhine. Charles the Bald took the Western Kingdom, which would slowly morph into modern France. And Louis the German was handed the Eastern Frankish Kingdom. That moment, the creation of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, is the true ground zero for German national history. Louis the German's territory was packed with distinct Germanic tribes. You had the Saxons, the Bavarians, the Alemanni, the Franconians, and the Thuringians. They all spoke different local dialects, but over time those dialects began to bleed together. The very word Deutsch, meaning German, originally just meant the language spoken by the common people, as opposed to the Latin spoken by the priests. But this new Eastern kingdom was immediately thrown into the fire. The Carolingian bloodline died out. The central king sitting on the throne was weak, while the local tribal dukes held the real power, treating royal orders like mere suggestions. The country fractured into massive semi-independent duchies like Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, Saxony, and Lorraine. And if internal chaos wasn't enough, monsters appeared on the borders. From the north, Viking raiders sailed down the rivers, leaving a trail of ash and corpses. From the east, a new terror arrived, the Magyars, fierce nomadic horsemen who burned German settlements to the ground without mercy. By 919, the German dukes realized they needed a real warlord to save them. They gathered and elected Henry the Fowler, the Duke of Saxony, as their king. Henry didn't waste time. He started throwing up massive stone castles to block the nomads and completely overhauled the military, building a devastating force of heavy armored cavalry. But the real turning point came with his son, Otto I, who took the crown in 936. Otto was a man of cold iron. His first order of business was to brutally crush the rebellious dukes and force them to their knees. To bypass the treacherous nobility, Otto made a brilliant, ruthless move. He allied himself with the church. He started handing out massive estates and government jobs to bishops and abbots. These men couldn't have children to inherit the land, so they were entirely dependent on the king. The church became the backbone of his power. In 955, Otto met the terrifying Magyar horde at the Battle of Lechfeld. It was a bloodbath, but Otto's heavy cavalry shattered the nomads completely. The threat from the east was wiped out forever, and Otto became a living legend across Europe, hailed as the savior of Christendom. With his borders secure and his rivals crushed, Otto looked south to Italy. The Italian peninsula was tearing itself apart in political anarchy, and the Pope was begging for a protector. Otto marched his armies over the Alps and took control. In 962, inside Rome, Pope John XII crowned Otto with the imperial diadem. This was the birth of something entirely new, a political beast that would eventually be known as the Holy Roman Empire. The word Roman was a massive flex, claiming total world dominance and a direct bloodline to the ancient Caesars. The word holy signaled the unbreakable sacred pact between the man with the sword and the man with the cross. But make no mistake, this was not a normal empire. The Holy Roman Empire had no capital city. The emperor and his massive royal court lived out of saddlebags, constantly riding from one city to the next, holding trials, collecting taxes, and showing the flag. The German lands were the beating heart of this empire, but it also swallowed up parts of modern Italy, the Czech Republic, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. The relationship between the emperor and the pope was incredibly toxic. The emperors believed they were the masters of the Christian world and demanded the right to pick the popes. The church fired back, claiming that the soul was always superior to the sword. This bitter power struggle dragged on for decades, sparking wars and assassinations. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the local princes and dukes maintained a dangerous amount of independence. The emperor was essentially a tightrope walker, constantly making deals and playing the nobles against each other just to keep the crown on his head. Otto's creation locked Germany into a strange, highly decentralized political matrix that would define its destiny for centuries. Fast forward to the dawn of the 16th century. The Holy Roman Empire is rotting from the inside out. The Catholic Church in Germany was a financial titan. It owned a full third of all the farmland, squeezed the peasants with crushing taxes, and treated the local political affairs of the German princes like its own personal chessboard. But nothing angered the commoners more than the indulgence trade. Indulgences were literal pieces of paper stamped by the Pope, sold for hard cash. The sales pitch was simple. Buy this paper, and your sins, no matter how horrific, are wiped clean. You could even buy your dead relatives out of purgatory. In October 1517, in the quiet university town of Wittenberg, a spark ignited that would burn the old world down. A local monk and theology professor named Martin Luther decided he had seen enough. He drafted a furious document outlining the corruption of the clergy. History knows it as the 95 Theses. Legend says Luther took a hammer and nailed that scroll directly to the heavy wooden doors of the Wittenberg Castle Church. Luther wasn't trying to destroy the church. He wasn't a revolutionary looking to burn the Vatican. He just wanted to cut out the rot. Luther argued that salvation wasn't a commodity you could buy with silver. He preached that a human soul was saved only by deep personal faith in God, not by buying a piece of paper from a priest in Rome. He declared that the Bible was the only true authority, and to prove it, he did something incredibly dangerous. He translated the Bible from the elite Latin into the rough, everyday German spoken by the common people. This wasn't just a religious act, it unified the German language. Suddenly, the people could read the Word of God for themselves. Luther's defiance triggered a massive cultural earthquake known as the Reformation. Thanks to the newly invented printing press, Luther's writings went viral, spreading across Germany like wildfire. Society cracked right down the middle. For the desperate peasants, the Reformation looked like a ticket to freedom from the crushing weight of the bishops and lords. But the German princes had a different angle. Many of them backed Luther for cold, hard political reasons. If they broke away from the Pope, they could seize the staggeringly wealthy monastery lands for themselves and stop sending their tax money across the Alps to Rome. The Catholic Church and the sitting Emperor Charles V panicked. They declared Luther a heretic, a wanted man, dead or alive. The princes who stood by Luther and protested the emperor's decree earned a new name: Protestants. Germany descended into a brutal religious civil war. The bloodletting only paused in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg. This treaty established a grim, pragmatic rule, whose realm his religion. It meant that whatever prince ruled a patch of land got to dictate whether his peasants prayed as Catholics or Protestants. The south of Germany largely stayed loyal to Rome, while the north and center went Protestant. But Augsburg was just a band-aid over a gunshot wound. By the early 17th century, the paranoia between Catholic and Protestant rulers had reached a boiling point. The princes were forming armed leagues, staring each other down. All it took was one spark. That spark landed in 1618 in the city of Prague, which was part of the empire. A group of Protestant noblemen, furious that their religious rights were being trampled by Catholic officials, marched into the Prague castle and literally threw the emperor's representatives out of a high window. This event, known as the Defenestration of Prague, pulled the trigger on the 30 Years' War. It lasted from 1618 to 1648. What started as a local religious dispute rapidly spiraled into an apocalyptic, continent-wide meat grinder. Foreign powers smelled blood and rushed in to grab territory. Denmark, Sweden, and even Catholic France jumped in on the Protestant side, mostly because France wanted to cripple the ruling Habsburg dynasty. The emperor was backed by the military might of Spain and the Pope. Germany became the slaughterhouse of Europe. For 3 decades, massive armies swept across the landscape. These weren't patriots. They were mostly ruthless mercenaries who didn't care about God or theology. They cared about gold. Warlords like Albrecht von Wallenstein operated on a terrifying philosophy: war feeds war. His armies didn't have supply lines. They survived by stripping the land bare, looting farms, burning towns, and taking whatever they wanted from the terrified civilians. The devastation was beyond human comprehension. Thousands of villages were wiped off the map. Bustling cities were reduced to ash. When Catholic troops stormed the city of Magdeburg, they slaughtered 20,000 men, women, and children and burned the city until nothing was left but smoking rubble. With the farms destroyed, a horrific famine set in. Desperate people were found eating grass roots and the bark off trees. And riding right behind the famine came the plague and typhus, wiping out entire regions. Historians estimate that the German lands lost between 30 and 40% of their entire population. In some areas, half the people vanished. The economy was completely shattered, thrown back 100 years. Eventually, the sheer horror and exhaustion forced everyone to the table. In 1648, in the region of Westphalia, diplomats hammered out the Peace of Westphalia. This treaty laid down the rules for the modern world. It finally guaranteed equal rights for Catholics and Protestants in Germany, but for the Holy Roman Empire it was a death sentence. The treaty gave the German princes total independence. They could now raise their own armies, declare war, and sign treaties with foreign kings as long as it wasn't directly against the emperor. After 1648, the emperor was just a figurehead. Germany fractured into a surreal, chaotic jigsaw puzzle of over 300 tiny independent microstates. Every little duchy, county, and bishopric had its own ruler, its own tiny royal court, its own currency, and its own border checkpoints. You had men ruling over a patch of land the size of a few farms, demanding to be treated like sovereign kings. This terminal fragmentation completely castrated Germany as a political power and suffocated its economic growth for the next 200 years. The nation was broken spiritually and physically. Following the nightmare of the 30 Years' War, the German lands lay stagnant in the ruins of their own making. The traditional heavy hitter within the Holy Roman Empire was always Catholic Austria, ruled by the ancient Habsburg dynasty. But up in the cold, sandy northeast, a new predator was quietly sharpening its teeth. This was the Kingdom of Brandenburg Prussia, or simply Prussia. The ruling family, the Hohenzollerns, looked at their vulnerable borders and made a calculated decision. Survival meant military supremacy. King Frederick William I, a man known to history as the Soldier King, turned his entire country into a massive military barracks. He built a terrifyingly disciplined army and drilled a culture of absolute obedience, extreme frugality, and fanatical loyalty to the state into the minds of his people. Prussia was a small country, but it punched way above its weight class. Its army became one of the most lethal killing machines in Europe. The real explosion came when his son, Frederick II, known as Frederick the Great, took the throne in 1740. Frederick was a complex guy. He played the flute, wrote philosophy, and traded letters with Voltaire. But the moment he put on a uniform, he was a cold-blooded, brilliant military tactician. Right after getting the crown, he marched his army straight into the wealthy Austrian province of Silesia, kicking off decades of brutal warfare with the Habsburgs. Prussia survived the 7 Years' War, fighting off a nightmare coalition of Europe's biggest superpowers. Frederick the Great doubled his population, expanded his borders, and cemented Prussia as a top-tier European predator, directly challenging Austria for the soul of Germany. Then came the 19th century and the storm of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte's French legions smashed the legendary Prussian army into the dirt. In 1806, Napoleon looked at the ancient, decaying Holy Roman Empire and officially put it out of its misery, dissolving it completely. The shock of being crushed by the French forced the Prussian elites to wake up. They launched massive internal reforms. They abolished serfdom, rebuilt their cities, and created the most advanced modern education system in the world. When Napoleon was finally defeated, the diplomats met at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Instead of bringing back the old empire, they created the German Confederation. It was a loose club of 39 independent states, with Austria and Prussia constantly circling each other, fighting for dominance. But money was pushing the Germans together faster than politics. In 1834, Prussia engineered the Zollverein, a massive customs union. It wiped out the ridiculous border tariffs between the German states, creating a unified economic zone. And the masterstroke, they deliberately locked Austria out of it. Germany industrialized with terrifying speed. Railroads sliced across the landscape. The Ruhr Valley became a blackened heart of coal and steel. The factories needed a unified country, but the old kings and princes refused to give up their crowns, and Austria and Prussia were deadlocked. In 1848, a wave of violent democratic revolutions swept across the country. The people manned the barricades, demanding free speech and a united Germany. But the monarchs brought in the army and shot the revolution to pieces. It became painfully clear that Germany would never be united from the bottom up by peaceful politicians holding debates. Enter the architect. In 1862, King Wilhelm I of Prussia appointed a brilliant, ruthless diplomat named Otto von Bismarck as his minister-president. Bismarck was a man of iron will, cold pragmatism, and a terrifyingly clear vision. He walked into the parliament and laid his cards on the table. He told them that the great questions of the day would not be decided by speeches and majority votes, but by iron and blood. That speech earned him his legendary title, the Iron Chancellor. Bismarck's master plan was simple: unite Germany entirely under Prussian control and cut Austria out of the picture completely. He didn't use treaties. He used a series of hyper-calculated, surgically precise wars. First, he teamed up with Austria to smash Denmark in 1864, grabbing the territories of Schleswig and Holstein. Then, he immediately turned around and engineered a crisis with his own ally. In 1866, the Austro-Prussian War kicked off. The rest of Europe thought Austria would crush the upstart Prussians. But the modernized Prussian war machine, commanded by the brilliant General Helmuth von Moltke, moved like lightning. At the Battle of Sadova, the Austrians were utterly annihilated. This is where Bismarck showed his terrifying genius. His generals wanted to march into Vienna and humiliate the Austrians. Bismarck said no. He didn't want a vengeful enemy on his border. He just wanted Austria to step out of the way. Austria surrendered its influence over Germany. Bismarck dissolved the old Confederation and built the North German Confederation, locking 22 states under Prussian dominance. Only one piece of the puzzle remained: the southern Catholic states like Bavaria. But standing in the way was France. Emperor Napoleon III was terrified of a massive united military superpower appearing right on his eastern border. Bismarck knew war with France was the only way to fuse the South to the North. But he needed France to throw the first punch so Germany would look like the victim. He pulled it off with a piece of paper, the EMS Dispatch. Bismarck took a routine diplomatic telegram from his king to the French ambassador, heavily edited it to make it sound incredibly insulting to both sides, and leaked it to the press. The French public went insane with rage. In July 1870, France declared war on Prussia. The trap slammed shut. The southern German states, swept up in a wave of nationalist fury, immediately threw their armies behind Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War was a slaughter. By September 1870, at the Battle of Sedan, the French army was surrounded and ripped apart. Emperor Napoleon III himself was taken prisoner. The Prussian war machine marched on and laid siege to Paris. In January 1871, inside the breathtaking Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, just outside the starving city of Paris, Bismarck's masterpiece was complete. Surrounded by military commanders and princes, the unified German Empire was declared, the Second Reich. King Wilhelm I was crowned Kaiser the Emperor, and Bismarck became the first imperial chancellor. France was forced to pay a crippling financial ransom and hand over the incredibly wealthy regions of Alsace and Lorraine. Bismarck had forged a nation with iron and blood, and in doing so, he completely shattered the balance of power in Europe. Right in the middle of the continent sat a heavily militarized industrial titan with 40 million people ready to dictate the future of the world. After the unification, the German Empire strapped itself to a rocket of industrial and economic growth. But the entire geopolitical strategy flipped upside down in 1888, when a young, arrogant man took the throne, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The new Kaiser was hungry for personal glory and deeply insecure. He looked at Bismarck's careful diplomatic tightrope act designed to keep Europe peaceful and decided it was a relic of the past. In 1890, the Kaiser fired the Iron Chancellor. Wilhelm announced a new direction: Weltpolitik, world politics. He declared that Germany was no longer going to just sit quietly in Europe. Germany demanded its place in the sun on the global stage. The problem was the globe was already carved up. Britain and France owned most of the colonial world. German industrialists and generals were furious that despite having the best economy, they had barely any overseas colonies. To force their way to the table, Berlin started frantically building a massive, heavily armed navy. This was a fatal miscalculation. It instantly terrified Great Britain, the undisputed master of the oceans. London looked at the German battleships and saw a gun pointed directly at their head. Europe began sliding toward the abyss. Terrified of each other, the great powers locked themselves into two massive, heavily armed suicide pacts. Germany formed the Triple Alliance with Austria, Hungary, and Italy. In response, Britain, France, and the Russian Empire formed the Entente. The paranoia was suffocating. The factories pumped out artillery and the generals sat in dark rooms planning the apocalypse. The German High Command relied on the Schlieffen Plan. It was a massive gamble. The idea was to launch a lightning strike through neutral Belgium, crush France before they could blink, and then put all their troops on trains to face the massive Russian army in the east. The goal was to avoid fighting a two-front war. In the summer of 1914, in the dusty streets of Sarajevo, a Serbian nationalist shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne. That single bullet started a chain reaction. Austria-Hungary issued a brutal ultimatum to Serbia. Germany handed Austria a blank check promising total military backing. The mobilization orders went out. In August 1914, the world fell apart. The First World War had begun. In those first few weeks, Germany was swept up in a manic patriotic fever. Young men marched to the trains with flowers in their rifles, absolutely convinced they would be home as conquering heroes before the leaves fell from the trees. The German war machine smashed into the west, tearing through Belgium and driving deep toward Paris. But the Schlieffen Plan failed. The French and British dug in their heels and stopped the German advance in the colossal, bloody Battle of the Marne. At the exact same time, the Russian army attacked in the east much faster than expected, forcing Berlin to pull troops away from the push on Paris. By the end of 1914, the fast-moving war was dead. In its place, a horrific scar of trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, from the Swiss border all the way to the freezing waters of the North Sea. The war devolved into an industrial meat grinder. Men lived for years in flooded, rat-infested holes in the earth, staring across fields of barbed wire. This was a new kind of hell. Heavy artillery that could vaporize a squad from miles away, machine guns, armored tanks, warplanes, and the creeping horror of poison gas. 1916 saw the absolute worst of it, the meat grinder of Verdun and the bloodbath of the Somme. Hundreds of thousands of young Germans were fed into the artillery fire, and the trench lines barely moved an inch. Things looked better on the Eastern Front. German forces, led by the ruthless duo of Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, hammered the Russian armies. When the 1917 revolution tore Russia apart, they tapped out. In early 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, handing Germany massive tracts of eastern territory. But it was a hollow victory. The German homeland was bleeding to death. The British Royal Navy had thrown a chokehold around the German ports, cutting off all food and raw materials. Starvation stalked the streets. The winter of 1916 into 1917 is still remembered as the turnip winter. The potato crop failed, and civilians had to survive by eating animal fodder. Disease ripped through the weakened population. Children were dying in their beds. The death blow came in 1917, when the United States of America entered the war on the side of the Entente, bringing an endless tidal wave of fresh men and industrial might. In the spring of 1918, the German generals rolled the dice one last time. They launched a massive, desperate offensive on the Western Front, trying to break the lines before the Americans arrived in force. They gained ground, but the cost in blood was catastrophic. The last of Germany's strength was spent. That summer, the Allies counterattacked slowly and methodically, pushing the exhausted Germans back. The army's spirit broke. Men deserted into the woods or surrendered by the thousands. Germany's allies began dropping like flies. Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, they all collapsed. The Second Reich was totally alone. By autumn of 1918, the generals walked into the Kaiser's room and told him the cold truth. The war was lost. They had to beg for an armistice. But the fire had already jumped the trenches and reached Germany itself. In late October, the Naval Command gave a suicidal order. They told the fleet stationed in Kiel to sail out for one final glorious death ride against the British Navy. The sailors looked at the order, realized it was insane, and refused to move. On October 31st, 1918, the Kiel Mutiny exploded. It instantly triggered the November Revolution. Across the country, furious workers and mutinous soldiers formed councils and seized control of the cities. On November 9th, the wave hit Berlin. Chancellor Max von Baden, realizing the country was evaporating under his feet, went to a balcony and unilaterally announced that the Kaiser had abdicated. That very same day, a republic was declared. Kaiser Wilhelm II, hiding at military headquarters in Belgium, bowed to the pressure of his generals, signed his abdication, and fled into exile in the Netherlands, where he died quietly years later. Bismarck's mighty German empire, built just 47 years earlier, was dead. On November 11th, deep in the Compiègne Forest in France, inside a private railway car belonging to French Marshal Foch, a German delegation signed the armistice. The guns went silent. Germany had surrendered. The final bill came due in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, which produced the Treaty of Versailles. The terms were designed to break Germany's spine. The treaty forced Germany to take sole, exclusive blame for starting the entire World War. They were stripped of all their overseas colonies and lost over 13% of their European land, handing Alsace-Lorraine back to France and vast eastern territories to the newly reborn Poland. The mighty German army was gutted, capped at a pathetic 100,000 men. They were banned from having heavy artillery tanks, an air force, or a real navy. And on top of it all, they were slapped with a staggering, astronomical bill for financial reparations to pay for the damage of the war. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a peace deal. It was a deep, festering psychological wound. It planted a toxic seed of national humiliation and victimhood in the German mind, a resentment that would eventually pave the way for the darkest chapter in human history. When the Kaiser's empire collapsed, Germany stared straight into the abyss of total anarchy. The streets of Berlin and other major cities became war zones, with radical communist militias exchanging gunfire with right-wing paramilitary death squads. Desperate to find some stability and draft a new constitution, the politicians fled the violence of the capital and gathered in the quiet, sleepy town of Weimar. There, in August 1919, they signed a constitution that transformed Germany into one of the most progressive parliamentary democracies on earth. But this young democracy was cursed from the moment it took its first breath. Millions of Germans hated the republic. A venomous conspiracy theory had taken root in the minds of the people, the stab-in-the-back myth. It claimed that the invincible German army had never actually lost on the battlefield. Instead, they had been betrayed, stabbed in the back by treacherous politicians, socialists and Jews back home. The new government spent its early years just trying to survive attacks from every political extreme. In 1920, right-wing forces tried to overthrow the state in the Kapp Putsch. Then, in 1923, down in Munich, a fringe extremist named Adolf Hitler, leading a tiny faction called the Nazi Party, tried to seize power in a violent uprising known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Both attempts failed, but the air was thick with violence. Economically, the country was bleeding out. Germany was chained to the massive reparation payments demanded by the victorious Allies. In 1923, when Berlin missed a shipment of coal, French and Belgian troops marched in and occupied the Ruhr Valley, the absolute industrial heartland of Germany. The German government told the local workers to go on strike and passively resist the invaders. But to pay those striking workers, the government did something disastrous. They turned on the printing presses and flooded the country with paper money. The result was hyperinflation on a scale the world had never seen. The German mark didn't just lose value, it evaporated. Prices in the shops were changing 3 or 4 times a day. Workers would get paid twice a day, grab their cash, and literally run to the bakery before the money turned into worthless paper. People hauled their wages in wheelbarrows and laundry baskets. It became cheaper to burn stacks of cash in the stove than to buy firewood. People glued banknotes to their walls because it was cheaper than wallpaper. A single loaf of bread, which cost a fraction of a mark at the start of the year, was selling for hundreds of billions of marks by the end of 1923. The life savings of the middle class were wiped out overnight, leaving a deep, traumatic scar on the national psyche. The country only pulled out of this death spiral through a brutal currency reset in 1924, replacing the worthless cash with the Rentenmark, combined with the diplomatic genius of Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann. The United States stepped in, pumping massive loans into the German economy through the Dawes Plan. The French pulled their troops out of the Ruhr. From 1924 to 1929, the Weimar Republic caught its breath. This era became known as the Golden Twenties. Despite the political cracks in the foundation, this period sparked an absolutely explosive renaissance in art, science, and culture. Berlin morphed into the avant-garde capital of the world. With the Kaiser's strict censorship gone, artists, writers, and architects pushed every boundary. In Weimar, an architect named Walter Gropius founded the Bauhaus School. It was a total revolution in design. Bauhaus stripped away the useless heavy decorations of the past, focusing on clean geometry, raw functionality, and human utility. If you look at modern city skylines or the furniture in your house today, you are looking at the echoes of Bauhaus. In literature, giants walked the earth. Thomas Mann won the Nobel Prize. Erich Maria Remarque ripped the glory out of warfare with his devastating novel, All Quiet on the Western Front. Playwright Bertolt Brecht completely shattered the traditional rules of theater. The nightlife in Berlin was legendary. Hundreds of cabarets, underground theaters, and dance halls pulsed with American jazz and the Charleston. The strict puritanical rules of the old empire vanished. The German film industry entered its golden age. Directors like Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau pioneered expressionist cinema, creating haunting, visually stunning masterpieces. Lang's sci-fi epic Metropolis changed the visual language of movies forever. At the same time, German science was untouchable. The physics institutes in Berlin were the center of the intellectual universe. Albert Einstein was there, reshaping reality with his theory of relativity, taking home the Nobel Prize in 1921. Right down the hall was Max Planck, the godfather of quantum theory. Germany was producing more scientific breakthroughs and Nobel laureates than anyone else on the planet, and German was the undisputed language of global science. But this brilliant electric era was a house of cards built entirely on American credit. In the fall of 1929, Wall Street crashed. The Great Depression slammed into the global economy like a freight train. American banks panicked and immediately demanded their loans back from Germany. Overnight, the financial lifeblood was sucked out of the country. The German economy disintegrated, factories padlocked their doors, international trade vanished. By 1932, over 6 million Germans were unemployed. 1 out of every 3 working-age men was suddenly standing on the street with nothing. Massive lines wrapped around city blocks just for a bowl of watery soup. Families lost their homes, they lost their dignity, they lost their hope. This economic apocalypse paralyzed the Weimar government. The moderate democratic politicians looked completely powerless, and the public abandoned them. Desperation drove the masses into the arms of the extremes. The elections turned into a vicious street-level war between the Communist Party and Adolf Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis weaponized the despair. They didn't just offer politics. They offered salvation. They promised jobs to the starving workers, they promised the wealthy industrialists protection from the communists, and they promised the entire nation that they would tear up the humiliating Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany to its former glory. The first attempt to build a German democracy was crumbling, crushed under the weight of a crisis it couldn't survive. By the early 1930s, the grinding misery of the Great Depression had completely hollowed out any faith the German public still had in democracy. Starvation, unemployment, and a deep-seated terror of a communist takeover pushed millions of desperate people toward the radical, absolute promises of the National Socialists. On January 30th, 1933, the aging president of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, made a fatal calculation. He appointed the leader of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler, as Chancellor, the head of the government. That day marked the death of the Weimar Republic. It was the birth of a totalitarian nightmare that the Nazis proudly branded the Third Reich. It took the new regime only a matter of months to dismantle every democratic freedom in the country. In February 1933, the Reichstag building in Berlin went up in flames under deeply suspicious circumstances. Hitler instantly blamed communist saboteurs and used the fire as the perfect excuse to declare a permanent state of emergency. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to assemble were wiped out overnight. Every political party except the Nazis was outlawed. Opposition leaders, union bosses, and independent journalists were hunted down, arrested, and thrown into the very first concentration camps. When President Hindenburg died in 1934, Hitler dropped the act. He merged the offices of President and Chancellor, declaring himself the supreme, unquestioned dictator, the Führer of the Third Reich. Germany was swallowed by a suffocating totalitarian machine. The minds of the public were subjected to relentless psychological conditioning, orchestrated by the Ministry of Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. Every book, radio broadcast, newspaper, and movie was weaponized to glorify the regime and inject its poisonous racial theories into the bloodstream of the nation. They built a cult of absolute blind obedience to the leader, fueled by a manufactured hatred for the enemies of the state. If you dared to think differently, you answered to the Gestapo, the secret state police whose methods were absolute terror. The entire German economy was hijacked and put on steroids, secretly preparing for a massive war. The government poured billions into building munitions factories and carving the famous Autobahn highways across the landscape. By pumping money into massive military contracts, the Nazis managed to wipe out unemployment. For a population traumatized by the Depression, this illusion of prosperity bought the regime massive fanatical support. But the dark beating heart of the Third Reich was its vicious, state-sponsored anti-Semitism. Nazi ideology preached that the Germanic people were a superior Aryan master race, and that the Jewish people were a biological enemy that had to be isolated and destroyed. In 1935, the regime passed the Nuremberg Laws. With a stroke of a pen, German Jews were stripped of their citizenship, their basic human rights, and forbidden from marrying Germans. Then in November 1938, the violence spilled into the streets. A wave of coordinated, horrific pogroms swept the country, known to history as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Nazi thugs torched synagogues, smashed Jewish businesses, and dragged thousands of innocent people to concentration camps simply because of their bloodline. It was a terrifying preview of the apocalyptic crimes to come. Hitler's foreign policy was aggressive from day one. He wanted to shred the Treaty of Versailles and conquer vast new territories in Eastern Europe, a concept the Nazis called Lebensraum, or living space. In 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland. The Western democracies did absolutely nothing. In March 1938, Hitler orchestrated the Anschluss, the forced annexation of Austria into the Reich. Later that fall, the leaders of Great Britain and France, desperate to avoid another world war, signed the Munich Agreement. They effectively handed Hitler the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia on a silver platter, hoping it would satisfy his appetite. This policy of appeasement was a catastrophic failure. It only proved to Hitler that the Western democracies were weak and lacked the stomach for a fight. On September 1st, 1939, the German war machine smashed across the border into Poland. Britain and France finally drew the line and declared war. The Second World War had begun, the most destructive, blood-soaked conflict in the human race. In the early years, the German military unleashed the Blitzkrieg Lightning War. It was a terrifying new style of combat. Massive spearheads of armored tanks backed by screaming dive bombers tore through enemy lines. In a matter of months, the Nazis conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In June 1940, they humiliated France, forcing them to surrender. Almost the entire Western and Central European continent was locked under the swastika. Then on June 22, 1941, Hitler made his fatal move. He tore up his non-aggression pact with Stalin and launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The war on the Eastern Front wasn't just a military campaign, it was a war of total annihilation. The Nazis didn't just want to defeat the Soviet army, they planned to erase the Soviet state entirely, enslave millions of Slavic people, and systematically starve the rest to death. Behind the advancing armies, the regime built a mechanized infrastructure of mass murder, the Holocaust. It was the deliberate industrialized slaughter of the Jewish people. Deep inside occupied Poland and Germany, the SS constructed sprawling extermination camps, places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek. Using gas chambers and industrial crematoriums, the Nazis systematically murdered 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Soviet prisoners of war, the Romani people, and anyone else deemed undesirable. It remains the most chilling, unfathomable crime of the 20th century. But the arrogance of the Nazi high command eventually broke the back of the Third Reich. The dream of a lightning victory in Russia froze to death in the snow just outside Moscow in the winter of 1941. The backbreaking turning point came in early 1943 in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. The German army was surrounded, starved, and pulverized until an entire army group, commanded by Field Marshal Paulus, finally surrendered. That summer, the German armored forces were decimated at the massive tank battle of Kursk. The Nazis permanently lost the initiative. From that moment on, it was a long, bloody, agonizing retreat back to Berlin. The German economy simply couldn't keep up with the staggering industrial output of the Allied coalition, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain. The sky over Germany turned black with American and British bombers. They unleashed firestorms on German cities, reducing Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden to smoking craters. The German civilian population was finally experiencing the absolute horror of the war their own leaders had started. In June 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, opening a second front and crushing Germany in a massive vice grip. By the spring of 1945, the curtain was falling. The Soviet Red Army launched a massive, apocalyptic assault on Berlin. The capital was surrounded, pounded into dust by relentless artillery fire. Trapped deep underground in his concrete bunker, realizing the war was entirely lost, and terrified of facing justice for his crimes, Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. In the dead of night between May 8th and May 9th, 1945, inside a building in the Berlin suburb of Karlshorst, the surviving German military commanders signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The Third Reich was dead. It left behind a totally devastated continent, a shattered country, millions of dead citizens, leveled cities, and a permanent heavy stain of shame for crimes against humanity. The totalitarian experiment had ended in absolute ruin. By May 1945, with the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich, the German state essentially ceased to exist. The country was an apocalyptic wasteland. Major cities were nothing but oceans of crushed brick and twisted steel. And millions of survivors were wandering the ruins, starving and homeless. The victorious Allies stepped in and took absolute control over the ashes. Following the agreements made at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, the map of Germany was sliced into 4 distinct military occupation zones. The capital, Berlin, sitting deep inside the Soviet zone, was also carved up into 4 sectors. At first, the Allies claimed they were going to manage Germany together. The plan was to root out the Nazis, strip the country of its weapons, and eventually rebuild a unified, peaceful democracy. But the honeymoon didn't last. The alliance between the West and the Soviet Union quickly mutated into deep paranoia and hostility. The world was plunging into the Cold War, and the ruins of Germany became ground zero for the ultimate standoff between Western capitalism and Eastern communism. Germany was essentially the Cold War in miniature. The Western powers, the US, Britain, and France, wanted to rebuild their zones on a foundation of free markets and fold Germany back into the European family. In 1948, the Western Allies pulled a massive financial trigger. They secretly introduced a brand new stable currency in their zones, the Deutschmark. The Soviet Union was furious. In retaliation, Joseph Stalin ordered a total blockade of all roads, railways, and canals leading into the isolated western sectors of Berlin. The Berlin blockade had begun. The goal was to starve the city out, but West Berlin survived thanks to one of the greatest logistical miracles in history, the Berlin airlift. For nearly 11 months, American and British cargo planes flew around the clock, dropping out of the sky every few minutes to deliver food, medicine, and coal to the trapped civilians. The blockade made the division of the country permanent. In May 1949, the Western occupation zones officially merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany, known as West Germany, with its capital in the quiet city of Bonn. A few months later, in October, the Soviets countered by turning their zone into the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, with East Berlin as its capital. The nation was ripped in half. 2 countries built on entirely opposing political, economic, and social realities. West Germany placed its bets on Western democracy and a free market economy. The first chancellor, a shrewd politician named Konrad Adenauer, alongside his economic minister, Ludwig Erhard, launched a system they called the social market economy. Fueled by massive cash injections from the American Marshall Plan, brutal financial reforms, and the sheer grit of the German workforce, the country exploded into life. History calls it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. By the late 1950s, West Germany had clawed its way back to become one of the wealthiest industrial powerhouses on earth. Shop windows were packed with goods, families were buying cars, and modern, comfortable housing was springing up everywhere. In 1955, West Germany fully aligned with the West, joining the NATO military alliance. Life on the other side of the line was a different universe. East Germany, the GDR, was being molded into a rigid socialist state under the watchful, paranoid eye of Moscow. Absolute power was held by the Socialist Unity Party, heavily guided for years by a hardliner named Walter Ulbricht. The economy was strictly planned by the government. Massive factories were seized by the state, and independent farmers were forced into collective cooperatives. Now, to be fair, East Germany eventually became the wealthiest country in the Soviet bloc, but compared to the explosive wealth of their neighbors in the West, they were suffocating. Store shelves were often empty of basic consumer goods, freedom of speech was non-existent, and watching over every citizen was the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi. It was one of the most pervasive, terrifying secret police forces in human history, using a massive network of civilian informants to spy on their own neighbors. In 1955, East Germany became a pillar of the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. The bizarre reality of these two Germanys collided in the streets of Berlin. For years, the border between the Soviet and Western sectors of the city remained open. East Berliners could literally walk across the street, step into the West, buy goods they couldn't find at home, and see the blinding neon lights of capitalism. Seeing the stark contrast in living standards and desperate to escape the suffocating political grip of the socialist regime, millions of young, educated East Germans started packing their bags. They walked into West Berlin and flew out to a new life in the West. By 1961, East Germany had hemorrhaged over a sixth of its entire population. The country was bleeding to death, facing total economic collapse. To stop this massive brain drain, the East German leadership, with a nod from Moscow, pulled the trigger on a desperate radical solution. In the dead of night on August 13, 1961, troops and construction crews descended on the border of West Berlin. The city woke up to find itself sliced in half by coils of barbed wire. Within days, that wire was replaced by a massive, ugly concrete wall. It was fortified with guard towers, blinding searchlights, and armed soldiers. The Berlin Wall physically ripped the city apart. It cut straight through neighborhoods, permanently separating families, friends, and lovers who suddenly found themselves trapped in different countries. The wall was guarded by East German border troops, operating under a brutal shoot-to-kill order. If you tried to cross that death strip without authorization, you were gunned down. Over the years, dozens of desperate people bled to death trying to climb over it. The Berlin Wall became the ultimate terrifying symbol of the Iron Curtain and a fractured world. By the late 1960s, the political ice started to crack. A new West German Chancellor, Willy Brandt, launched a strategy known as Ostpolitik, New Eastern Policy. Brandt realized that pretending East Germany didn't exist was a dead end. He decided to start building bridges. He signed groundbreaking treaties with the Soviet Union and Poland, officially accepting the borders drawn after World War II. In 1972, West and East Germany signed the Basic Treaty, finally recognizing each other as sovereign states. Tensions cooled. Border crossings opened slightly so relatives could visit. Phone lines were reconnected and trade began to flow. But despite these diplomatic handshakes, the Berlin Wall still stood, a massive concrete scar reminding everyone of the deep ideological chasm splitting the German soul. The second half of the 1980s sent a geopolitical earthquake tearing through Eastern Europe. In the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev took power and rolled out his policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. For the Soviet bloc, this meant Moscow was no longer going to send in tanks to crush local dissent. This shift sent a massive surge of electricity through the people of East Germany. They wanted what Moscow was getting. They demanded internal reforms, the right to speak their minds, and the freedom to travel. But the East German Old Guard, led by Erich Honecker, dug their heels in. They refused to change, desperately trying to keep the iron grip tight. This stubbornness pushed the country to the breaking point. In the summer of 1989, neighboring Hungary decided to cut the barbed wire on its border with Austria. Suddenly, there was a gaping hole in the Iron Curtain. Tens of thousands of East Germans didn't hesitate. They packed their cars, drove through third countries, and poured into the West. Back inside East Germany, the pressure cooker exploded. Massive, peaceful protests erupted. Every Monday after church services in Leipzig, Berlin, and other cities, hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens flooded the streets. They marched together, chanting a simple, devastating slogan, "We are the people." This uprising went down in history as the Peaceful Revolution. The East German leadership was paralyzed. They lost control of the streets and were forced to force Honecker to resign. The new panicked government tried to throw water on the fire by drafting a law to slightly loosen travel restrictions. Then, on the evening of November 9th, 1989, a mistake changed the world. Politburo member Egon Krenz handed the text of the new travel regulations to a government spokesman named Günter Schabowski, who was about to go on live television for a press conference. Schabowski hadn't even read the document. At the very end of the conference, a foreign journalist asked him when these new travel rules would actually take effect. Schabowski looked confused, shuffled through his papers, and mumbled the words that made history. "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." The plan was actually to enact the law the next morning so the border guards could be briefed. But the damage was done. The news blasted across radio and television. Within an hour, thousands of East Berliners surged toward the heavily fortified checkpoints of the Berlin Wall. The border guards were completely in the dark. They had no orders from the top. Faced with a massive, crushing crowd of their own people, they made the decision not to open fire. Around 11 p.m., the commander at the Bornholmer Street checkpoint gave up and ordered his men to lift the barrier. The dam broke. Thousands of people flooded into West Berlin. They were met with tears, screaming tight embraces and popping champagne corks. The Berlin Wall, the concrete monster that had divided a nation for 28 years, was rendered utterly useless in a single night. Ordinary citizens climbed on top of the wall and started physically smashing it to pieces with hammers and chisels. The fall of the wall put the reunification of Germany on a hyperspeed track. The architect of this massive geopolitical maneuver was West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. With incredible diplomatic skill, he managed to convince the nervous leaders of the world's superpowers that a united, massive Germany would not be a threat to global peace. In September 1990, the 2+4 agreement was signed in Moscow by the two Germanys and the four victorious powers of World War II, the US, the USSR, Britain, and France. The Allies officially surrendered all their occupation rights over German soil. On October 3rd, 1990, it was official. The country was whole again. The five newly re-established states of the former East Germany were legally absorbed into the Federal Republic of Germany. Today, October 3rd, is celebrated as the Day of German Unity. By 1991, the Parliament voted to move the capital back to the heart of the country, Berlin. A new era, the Berlin Republic, had begun. But fusing two completely different worlds together was brutal, complicated, and incredibly expensive. The East German economy was a rusted-out shell. Once exposed to ruthless Western capitalism, the old socialist factories collapsed and unemployment skyrocketed. The government had to implement a solidarity tax on the citizens to pay for massive infrastructure upgrades, rebuilding roads, telecommunications, and entire cities in the East. Beyond the money, there was a deep psychological wall. For 40 years, the people of the East and the West had lived on different planets, and bridging that cultural divide took generations. Despite the growing pains, the reunited Germany rapidly asserted itself as a titan on the global stage. It became the driving engine behind European integration. In 1992, Germany was instrumental in pushing through the Maastricht Treaty, laying the foundation for the modern European Union. In 1999, Germany did the unthinkable. It voluntarily retired the beloved rock-solid Deutschmark to adopt the euro, cementing a unified European economy. By the dawn of the 21st century, Germany was the undisputed economic locomotive of Europe. Driven by high-tech manufacturing, precision engineering, cutting-edge chemicals, and a massive export sector, Germany became an industrial heavyweight. German cars, machinery, and medical equipment set the global gold standard. A defining figure in this modern era was Angela Merkel. She held the office of Chancellor for 16 years from 2005 to 2021. As the first woman to hold the position, she steered the country through a gauntlet of global disasters, from the massive financial crash to the pandemic. Under her watch, Germany cemented its role as the political anchor and the primary stabilizing force of the entire European Union. The history of Germany is a labyrinth unlike any other in Europe. Over 2,000 years, this land has swung like a massive pendulum between absolute extremes. From a fractured puzzle of hundreds of tiny bickering fiefdoms to the terrifying might of colossal empires. From the dizzying heights of scientific genius and cultural brilliance to the absolute darkest depths of moral collapse and totalitarian horror. If there is one defining characteristic of the German story, it is the eerie, almost supernatural ability to rise from the ashes of total annihilation. In the 9th century, after the Frankish collapse, in the 17th century, after the bloodbath of the 30 Years' War, and in the 19th century, after Napoleon burned it down, the country always found a way to reboot itself. But Germany's ultimate test came in the second half of the 20th century. Left completely pulverized, physically severed by a concrete wall, and suffocating under the crushing weight of historical guilt for the atrocities of the Third Reich, the nation did more than just rebuild its factories. It did something much harder. It looked its own demons dead in the eye. Modern Germany is built entirely on the foundation of historical memory. If you walk the streets of Berlin today, you will see monuments of national triumph standing right next to massive, solemn memorials dedicated to the victims of their own state terror. It is a country that proved to the world that true national greatness isn't measured by military aggression. It is measured by a booming economy, cutting-edge science, an uncompromising respect for human rights, and the willingness to find peaceful compromises for the future. The collapse of the Berlin Wall stands as a permanent reminder to the world, no matter how thick the concrete, no matter how tall the guard towers, barriers will eventually crumble against the human demand for freedom and unity. Today, Germany looks forward, standing as the guardian of European stability, a living, breathing testament to how a dark, violent past can forge a stronger, wiser nation.